So I'm curious to know what both of your processes have been in terms of your definition of success and if it's shifted at all.
Yeah, I think for me, to be honest, I've never gone into a prep like measuring success on placings. Um, and I've told this, to some of my athletes. It's like my 2017 prep was, the best I've looked, but placing wise was significantly worse than like 2012. But I felt like I had finally kind of refined my process at that point, and things were like I was happy with the strategy that I had put together and in the physique that I had brought. So the placings have never really meant much to me because I just look at that as like a byproduct of how well, one, your genetics and just how well you execute your plan, which, for a lot of, or for most competitors, I think it's just giving ample time to get in shape. Like I think most people have gotten to the point where like my second prep, the goal going into that was like I don't want that anxiety of whether or not I'm going to be ready in time. And I think some of that inevitably can kind of creep in, but the solution to that, like that's manageable. It's like give yourself an ample timeline, maybe give yourself an open-ended timeline where it's like, okay, I'm committed to this goal, but I don't want a date staring me in the face 25 weeks out. I'm going to I'm going to compete when I'm ready. And so then it becomes less about like, am I going to be ready for this show versus like, when am I going to be ready for this show? So I think it reframing it in that context, I think kind of helped me. Um, but I don't know if that's for everybody because I think some people may need a date to kind of commit to the process. And so, but if like, no matter what, I'm going to compete, then I think, especially for first time competitors, giving yourself an ample timeline is important because most people don't. Like, there's plenty of muscular physiques that, I mean, how many times, Brad, have we heard like that guy would be really good if he had like 3 or 4 more weeks of dieting, Um, and that's like within their control. I mean, they might not have known it at the time, but in a follow-up prep, it's just like for me now, like the motivation is like, let's see how much I can refine the process and get from point A to point B in an efficient manner with, it being the least invasive on my lifestyle as I can, given what the goal is anyway.
My answer to your question, Amanda, is super convoluted. And it's basically that way because I've always, my whole life, been a competitive person, my whole life. And I've always competed in sports where there was a clear-cut winner, If it was running a race, there was somebody that placed first and second and third. I raced cars, and I remember as a young, probably late teen, early 20-year-old saying, I am never going to compete in any sport where there is not a clear-cut winner. I'm not going to compete in any sport where somebody else determines, my placing. It's going to be, I ran the fastest time. I threw the furthest. I completed the laps the quickest before everybody else. And then lo and behold, in 2003, I'm competing in bodybuilding.
Joke's on you.
Yeah.
But yeah, with that being said, early in my career, I was friggin' spoiled, and I did focus on placing, and eventually my bubble was burst, because of that. I showed up to my first show. Nobody had ever seen anybody that lean ever. I was competing against the pro, basically. I wasn't on stage with him, but they were saying, you could compete with that guy. You could stand up there with that guy. Next year, kind of the same thing. I won my show, and basically I was spoiled because all I had to do was get shredded. That was the thing in my control. I had to diet hard, get shredded. And if I got up there on stage, I was going to win. I was probably going to win my class, at a minimum. And then of course, going for the overall, that to me, if I won the overall, it was kind of like a bonus. I just wanted to win my class. And, then of course 2006 happens and I come up against Mr. Jeffrey Alwarts, and then all of a sudden now it's kind of like I get this realization of, hey, this is not a guarantee, and I got to kind of start thinking more so about this subjective sport and what is the definition of success, versus winning, et cetera, et cetera. But then of course, I took 2007 off just to kind of improve, and then 2008, by that time I had forgotten about it and I'm back to the Brad that wants to show up to win. All I got to do is show up and get shredded, and I'll win. And then that was all reinforced. And I remember vividly in 2008, no, I'm sorry, it was 2009 because Eric was competing. Because let's see, I won my pro card in 2008 and then Jeff won it in 2009. Yeah, so it was 2009. Eric was going to these shows where he knew Jeff was going to be at, and it was like, I remember thinking to myself, why is he even doing that? He's not going to beat Jeff. And I admired him for it. He was competing knowing that he was not going to win, the overall, but it was in my mind. It's like, why is he even doing that? I wouldn't even be doing that show. I would be targeting some other show, but it was because the competitive Brad that was thinking placing and thinking winning the pro card, and even to this day, that sometimes when I hear I want to win my pro card, or I want to win this show, it's kind of a red flag for me because once I got into the pro ranks, that's when Brad's bubble was burst, and then I remember my first pro show, it was kind of like I was almost bawling because I knew I was not in contention. I was not one of those guys in the middle, that they were looking at. And really the next few years was rough, because of just that reason. There was no way Brad was going to compete like in the pros like he did in the amateurs, and even to this day, Brad couldn't compete with a lot of the amateurs, that are out there, and so that whole definition of success is totally changed. It's totally changed, Did I even answer the question? I'm just sitting there talking
where
about
is it now?
stories. Yeah, and where is it now? I mean, for me personally, like we talked about earlier, I'm not even really thinking competing. I'm thinking prepping. That's what we're doing right now is prepping. Brad wants to go through the prep process, and I'm super early in the stages, and I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying overcoming being hungry and being tired and getting in there and still doing having a good session and then defining what that good session is, So I've come a long way since the guy that kind of focused on placing, But I mean, that word compete, I wrote that down because that still is it's a tricky thing, because the competitive Brad is like, okay, if you want to win your pro card, we need to target, let's say that I'm dealing with an athlete that's really earlier in the career. They've got a good physique, but that's their emphasis is winning their pro card. It's kind of like, okay, no guarantees here, obviously, but what we should probably do if that's your emphasis is maybe we target these smaller shows, where you're not going to be going up against the freaks, or at least the freaks aren't going to be looking at these shows, and you've got a pretty good chance of actually competing and winning your pro card, and I have clients to this day that are kind of like, do I even have a chance at competing? And it's like, that's such a tricky word in this sport,
Yeah.
It's just, that's kind of a tough thing because there's always that competing that's in there, but you have no control over where your placing is, I mean, sure, we could target these shows to where your chance of actually competing and winning is better, but there's still no guarantee, and this might be a multi-year process. And then of course, we've all been there. I've hit, kind of like smaller shows, and my very first overall, it was like I was competing against 3 guys in my class and 2 in the overall. There's like 5 whole bodybuilders there. And yeah, I won my overall, but it didn't really feel very good. It's like, okay, I won, how much did I really compete? So yeah, so that word compete, it's such a tricky thing, especially when you are a competitive person competing in this sport.
Yeah. I think it can be looked at like competing against other people versus like competing against yourself, you know, and it's like, as cliche as that sounds, I like to pose the question to people. It's like, okay, if you, let's say someone's competed before, would you rather, like, this upcoming prep, like, if you had to pick one, which one of these would you pick with, okay, you could either place first and win every show, but be at like 80% of your potential, or place dead last and have emptied the tank and feel like, okay, I couldn't have shown up looking any better. And I think that's that for me, it's like I would go with the second option 10 out of 10 times, because it's that competition kind of within that I think drives really great competitors. Not putting myself up in that category, but it's like, I think that that's what's necessary though, to really show up looking the way you want, you know, season after season. It's managing the variables that are within my control. And I think sometimes another follow-up question, like Brad, you said, you know, you have athletes that ask like, okay, I want to win my pro card. It's sometimes it's uncomfortable for me, like as a coach, to ask this because I don't want it to come across the wrong way. But like getting into like, why do you want to win your pro card? You know, like what value are you assigning to that and why? Because it certainly doesn't come with any financial reward. Like, is it a matter of like how you would view yourself, or how you feel like you know you would be perceived by others? Because I think that's important to, and if it does come down to like, okay, I feel like I will be a failure if I don't win my pro card. Well, what if you get in the best shape of your life? Like, how is that not a huge success? You know? So kind of getting, you know, to kind of circle back to what Amanda was saying, like getting to their, like the value and why they have those values surrounding their goal.
Yeah, Brian, you actually touched on something that I wanted to connect with Brad in terms of competing. The word competing in general is just our own self-assessment, whether it's comparing ourselves externally or internally. Are we basing just our relationship with ourselves and just what compassion and capacity we have towards ourselves if we make a mistake, or we place last, or we place first? Are we basing it just on these variables that can just change moment to moment to moment? Or are we just providing space for ourselves to be human, first of all, not just machines that accomplish things and collect all of these successes? Which, yes, then we want to look at why we're doing it in the first place. What are we gaining from? What are we learning in the process as just a being versus this machine and capitalism of being successful? And I think a lot of us avoid digging into that because we do get a lot of external validation when we are successful, or we just do a competition. And even if we place last, you know, like our family and our friends they're really supportive and we look freaking shredded. But it's fleeting. It's always fleeting. And that kind of leads to, I think, the next part of like post-show blues. What happens afterwards? Like, okay, you might have won, or you might have completely tanked it and you feel empty afterwards. So that's kind of another cue towards, why did you do it in the first place? Or were you even present throughout the entire experience that you kept, you know, looking forward to, or pointing your fantasy or your mind's eye towards, and you weren't in it at all? Like, you weren't present in it at all. And I think a lot of us do that just outside of bodybuilding.